Well, if you were wondering who is going to be held responsible for the Mets' disappointing season on their coaching staff, the answer ended up being pretty much everybody but Carlos Mendoza and Antoan Richardson.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. I've been covering the New York Mets on this show since the 2019 season. This is the number one daily podcast in the New York Mets. If you want to find any of my written work, you do so over at justbaseball.com, where I work as the editor-in-chief. Now, for those of you who are not aware of the sweeping changes the Mets made to their coaching staff on Friday, it'll be easier for me to tell you who is staying rather than who is leaving. The Mets completely clean house. Carlos Mendoza, we already knew was going to stay. Antoan Richardson could not possibly be fired with cause after he nearly turned Juan Soto into a 40-40 player this year with what he did from the stolen base department. The way the Mets were the most efficient team in Major League Baseball and stealing bases. Antoan Richardson deserved to come back and sounds like he will come back. He's been invited to return, as has strategy coach Danny Barnes and coaching assistant Rafael Fernandez. So that's who's staying. Assistant pitching coach Desi Drusel and bullpen coach Jose Rosado have been given permission to speak with other teams before a new pitching coach is hired, but it seems like a door is open for their return. Everyone else gone. Jeremy Hefner, gone. Eric Chavez, Jeremy Barnes, gone. John Gibbons, gone. Glenn Sherlock, retired. It is a clean slate for this coaching staff. And you had to wonder at some point who is going to be held accountable for this past season. And I'll be honest, and we'll talk more about the coaches that were let go in the next segment. I was surprised that they completely cleaned house here. I thought that Jeremy Hefner might stay. I thought that there was a chance that, maybe John Gibbons would stay. I really didn't know how far this was going to go, but ultimately somebody had to be held accountable for what happened to the Mets this season. And Eric Chavez said it best of The Athletic. He said, I've been around long enough to know how things work, and there was going to be collateral damage. And he says, to be honest with you, there should be. Because the reality is this Mets team was majorly disappointing, and something had to give. David Stearns was never on the hot seat. I know some fans wanted him there. Never going to happen. I think if the Mets lost 100 games next year, he still wouldn't necessarily be on the hot seat. There'll be a lot more questions to answer. But David Stearns is running this franchise and will run this franchise, in my opinion, for a very long time, or at least he's got years on this contract left. I'd be very surprised if he didn't, at minimum, finish out the 5-year deal. Carlos Mendoza, right after the final game of the season, you had reporters that were saying Carlos Mendoza will not be fired. And then David Stearns confirmed that the next day. Now, I think you could have made the case to fire Carlos Mendoza. And in the heat of the moment after game 162, when I went on and did a live stream and I talked about what I thought was a horribly managed game by Mendoza, I think there was a case to be made to let him go. I don't think he was great this season. And in that game 162, I thought his feel was terrible. I did not like that he pulled Sean Manaea in the second inning of that game. Now, granted, if you're managing like a playoff game, we've seen other managers do exactly that. You saw Mike Schilt do that in game 3 of the Cubs-Padres series, where Yu Darvish did not have it. And so once Darvish gave up a run and the bases were loaded, he went to the bullpen. The difference, it was a lot more of a meltdown than what Manaea showed in that game 162. And Schilt was armed with one of, if not the best, super bullpen in baseball. Mendoza was not. But one game, while ultimately that is what made the difference in the Mets making the playoffs or not, that does not define this season. That does not, fully account for the collapse that we saw. A lot went into how things went wrong for the Mets. And again, you could have pointed the finger at Carlos Mendoza, but I think what the Mets are doing here and what they are showing is they don't want to have that constant turnover with managers. They want to end the streak, and that streak is 2-year stints for their managers. Because if you go back ever since Terry Collins, who held down the post for 7 seasons from 2011 through 2017, it's been 2 years and out. Mickey Callaway, 2018, 2019, done. Luis Rojas, 2020, 2021, done. Buck Showalter, 2022, 2023, done. If Carlos Mendoza was fired, it'd be 2024, 2025, done. The Mets are showing faith in Carlos Mendoza by cleaning out his staff, which might sound a little funny, but I think Zach Scott provides some really good insight on this. Zach Scott, of course, was the Mets GM in 2021, and he is now, you've seen him, I'm sure, on SNY. He has moved on to an advisory role. He has his own company where he advises, different front offices across sports, and he's doing some media. But he has sent out a tweet that I thought was very interesting. He says, this follows a common pattern when you hire a new manager, but he doesn't choose his staff. Once the heat gets turned up, he usually pushes to choose his own guys. After he gets that, the bullseye is squarely on his back. And then he says, while I know they let go some excellent coaches, I think it's fair to give a manager a chance to sink or swim on his terms. Empower him while partnering with him to ensure a good hiring process. If you think that Carlos Mendoza has been held in the dark since the end of the season, that there was a conversation with Mendy and Stearns, hey, your job's safe, and then Carlos Mendoza was set aside and David Stearns went through his own process and came to the conclusion that all of these coaches should be let go, that is not a realistic look into the working relationship of Stearns and Mendoza. These guys partnered together. When David Stearns hired Mendoza, it was a partnership that was made. And Stearns has expressed the utmost confidence in Carlos Mendoza. And in a weird way, as Zach Scott is outlining here, this is another form of confidence in Mendoza in that they're now going to go through this process together. If the culture was off, they are going to now go through a hiring process where they're going to have to get a new pitching coach, new hitting coach, new third base coach, and all the support staff around those guys, new bench coach, new catching coach, all these different things that they might be looking to add. And they're going to go through this process hand in hand. Carlos Mendoza is going to be part of all of these interviews. And so they're going to pick this next staff in hopes of building a new culture for the Mets going into 2026 that's going to help bear a winner. And look, it's going to be a lot more than coaches that gets the Mets on track. Roster building is very much paramount to what the Mets have to do here. But I don't think, while we will go through each individual coach that was let go, while I don't think any one of them could be scapegoated for this season, I think after what happened, it's okay to say, you know what? We got to clean the deck a little bit and start fresh. And that's starting fresh while still keeping your management structure intact, with David Stearns, of course, as the president of baseball operations, and Carlos Mendoza, the manager of this ball club. And I am very curious to see what the next move is, who the Mets ultimately end up hiring. But I'm okay with the decision here, even if I disagree with some of the moves. I'm okay with saying, you know what just happened is unacceptable, and someone's got to be held accountable. And in this case, it was most of the Mets coaching staff. So we'll talk about who got let go and why in just a minute here. This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the daily fantasy app where making the right call can actually pay off. You and I make decisions every day, but on Prize Picks, being right means cashing in. With football back, Prize Picks is the simplest and fastest way to get in on the action. Just pick more or less on 2 to 6 player projections, and you can turn your takes into real prizes all in less than 60 seconds. What's great about Prize Picks, you don't just have to stick to football. You can go across multiple sports when you're building out your lineup. So maybe you're looking at the MLB postseason at the same time as your Sunday football slate, and you can combine players from both leagues into one lineup. It's quick, it's easy. Honestly, it's my favorite way to follow along with the crowded sports schedule. And the best part, if one of your picks misses, Prize Picks invented the flex play, so you can still double your money. Download the Prize Picks app today and use the code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. Let's go LOCKEDONMLB for $50 in lineups after your first $5 play. Prize Picks, It's good to be right. If you're an everydayer that always tunes into the show, make sure you become a Locked On Mets insider. This is our texting service. We get updates from me anytime news breaks on the Mets. So today, when all the coaching news was announced, the first place I went was to my subtext to all my Locked On Mets insiders and let you all know what was going on. And then I was texting with a lot of you back and forth after the news dropped. A lot of text about why was Jeremy Hefner just fired. And it was good to go back and forth and give you some explanation before I actually did a show here for Saturday. So if you want to be a Locked On Mets insider and be part of our texting service, find the link in the episode description or go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. Now, as we break down all the different firings here or parting of ways, Jeremy Hefner has to be the first name talked about because it was the most surprising. Jeremy Hefner has been part of the Mets organization as their pitching coach since the 2020 season. He was the pitching coach for 6 seasons, 3 different managers. First, actually, 4 if you want to count Carlos Beltrán's cameo as the Mets manager before he was let go due to the Astros sign stealing scandal. But that is when Hefner first came on. He was the pitching coach under Luis Rojas for a couple of years, the pitching coach under Buck Showalter, and remained the pitching coach under Carlos Mendoza the last 2 seasons. Now, I really do believe Jeremy Hefner is a great pitching coach. I think he had a very large impact on the Mets franchise over the last couple of years, really helping blend the Mets into the new age of analytics. And he was really good at being able to take that information and present it to pitchers who at times might be a little bit apprehensive to adopt this new information. But as a former big league pitcher, he was able to cross those lines really well. And I think you look at the 2024 season and what the Mets got out of Luis Severino and Sean Manaea and Jose Quintana and David Peterson and even Tyler McGill. I thought he did great work in 2024. First half of 2025, the Mets were getting by through smoke and mirrors with Max Kranick and Huáscar Brazaban, filling supersized roles in that bullpen, and Griffin Canning and Tyler McGill, having career years, along with Clay Holmes making that transition from reliever to starter. I think you look at the first half of the season, it would have been stunning to think Jeremy Hefner wasn't coming back because he was such an integral part of what had the Mets with the best record in baseball through the first couple months of the season. Certainly wasn't the Mets offense that had him in that position. Yet the breakdown this year was the pitching. What happened in the second half, what happened at the trade deadline, it was a disaster for the Mets pitching. And so while I think Jeremy Hefner is a very good pitching coach, well, I think the Mets are going to have a hard time replacing him. I also can understand that at times you just need a fresh voice. And if the Mets really wanted to completely change the dynamics inside that clubhouse without overhauling a roster that's very hard to overhaul. I mean, really, this offseason, as we've already touched on, and we'll certainly spend plenty of shows coming up talking about it more, your biggest decisions on the culture of your clubhouse or the players that you could turn over here. It's re-signing Pete Alonso and Edwin Diaz, and if you don't, good luck replacing them because they're both the best at their position in this free agent class. And then it's potentially trading a Jeff McNeil or a Mark Vientos, one of those guys that has been part of this team for the last couple of years. McNeil, obviously, for a long time. Or it could be trading a Mauricio or Acuna, but that's not really, changing the culture inside the clubhouse or changing, the makeup of the team. Those are guys that still haven't fully established themselves at the big league level. But the bottom line is the Mets have made the decision. They have come to the conclusion that changing the coaching staff is a way to turn the page to hopefully better baseball ahead. And so with that, holding Jeremy Hefner accountable and really just not picking up his option, it can be justified. I can't say that it completely makes sense to me or that I would have necessarily made that move, but I'm not in that clubhouse. I'm not the one that makes those decisions. I don't know what the day-to-day looked like. I don't know, if Jeremy Hefner's message was falling on deaf ears or if this, again, is just trying to start anew. And whatever it is, you can't say that Hefner is not culpable at all for what happened because he is the pitching coach or he was the pitching coach, and it was a disaster the last 2 months of the season. So again, while it's not necessarily what I would have done, I'm not going to really complain about it or say the Mets are making a mistake here. Now, when it comes to the hitting coach decision, Jeremy Barnes was brought on by Zach Scott ahead of the 2021 season. He was supposed to be in charge of hitting development in 2022. He became the assistant hitting coach to Eric Chavez. Chavez brought on to work under Buck Showalter. 2022, the Mets won 100 games, and Chavez ends up becoming the bench coach in 2023, leaving Jeremy Barnes to assume the role of hitting coach. 2024 comes around after that horrible 2023 season, and Eric Chavez is demoted back to hitting coach. John Gibbons becomes the bench coach, and instead of demoting Barnes back to assistant hitting coach, the Mets had co-hitting coaches. Eric Chavez again spoke to The Athletic, and here's what he said about what happened this season and having two hitting coaches. He says the consistency wasn't there. I'm not a huge expected stats guy. You are who you are. For me, it comes down to wins and losses. As a whole, we failed. He's spot on with that. He continued to say you cannot have two hitting coaches or two co-hitting coaches, two voices. Ultimately, one person needs to have the voice. Jeremy and I made it work. We had a good working relationship, but it definitely was not ideal. That to me actually suggests that while they had a good working relationship, doesn't seem like they had a great personal relationship. Not saying there was a huge rift between the two, but maybe they didn't see eye to eye that much. And so if you had two combating, voices trying to fill that same role, yeah, I think it made a lot of sense to let go of the hitting coaches and find somebody new. I think that was almost expected after the season the Mets had, to let go of the hitting coaches, which is funny because they were a top 10 offense in baseball by a lot of stats and metrics, but a lot of that's due to personnel. When you have Juan Soto and Pete Alonso and Francisco Lindor all having the seasons that they had, as well as even Brandon Nimmo didn't have the best year, but still, hit 25 homers and drove in, over 90. Yeah, your stats overall are going to be okay, but we saw way too often this team go through lulls offensively and have some really bad stretches. So I think it makes complete sense to get rid of the hitting coaches. John Gibbons walked away on his own. He said it's time for some new blood there. He said, I'll see where baseball takes me next. I loved every minute of it. Some wonderful people throughout the organization. Mendy and David Stearns are the real deal. So gave them a little voice or a vote of confidence on the way out. Not much to say about John Gibbons going. Again, it just kind of follows in line with the direction the Mets were taking here, which is just cleaning house and starting anew. Glenn Sherlock retired, so not much to say there. And Mike Sauerbrei, the Mets third base coach, who was their third base coach for the last two seasons, he was one of the few guys that was really sort of hired after Carlos Mendoza. You had Sauerbrei, you had John Gibbons, you had Antoan Richardson. So there was a few, but the fact that Carlos Mendoza inherited his pitching coaches his pitching coach and his hitting coaches, I think that's the biggest change here. But while you're making moves, clean the deck, clear it all out, and I think it made sense that the one guy that prioritized keeping was Antoan Richardson, because you don't want to lose that guy with the way that he, again, really did, make the Mets this incredible stolen-based team that without having a ton of speed on the roster, but yet they were so good at taking those bases. So I think the Mets are on a good path here. I think it makes sense to try to change up your coaching staff. You got nothing to do right now other than interview coaches anyway until the offseason officially starts. You got multiple weeks here where you can be doing preliminary interviews with a lot of guys. Obviously, if they're actively coaching in the playoffs, you can't do too much, but you still can have some Zoom interviews. I mean, that's not unheard of. So the Mets are now going to go through this process. I'm very encouraged to see what they come up with, but I think this was, again, a way to, in a weird sort of fashion, give some more ownership of this team to Carlos Mendoza, to allow him to make these hires. And under his staff, we'll see what happens. But this was the Mets holding somebody accountable for the season that was, and we'll see if ultimately a changing coaching staff is part of the solution to the problem that popped up this season, where this team just fell off from being the winning club that they were from June on last year through June of this year, pretty much a calendar year of being a really good baseball team, fell off the cliff. So now You are starting over in some ways, but you are keeping your leadership intact. And honestly, it has been so exhausting, the turnover this franchise has had, from managerial changes to GM changes, all of it. I mean, I have been covering the New York Mets on this show since the 2019 season. That was my 7th year covering the Mets, the 7th season that I've covered. And it was, there's been 3 managers, and there's been, Callaway, Rojas, 4 managers since I started this show, and 5 GMs. So now you have Stearns in place, Mendoza in place, and I'm fine with that. Do I think that Carlos Mendoza had a good season? No. Do I think David Stearns had a good season? No. But do I still believe in them as the leadership group for this team moving forward? I think I do. And again, I'm very interested to see who could potentially be coming into this organization. That's where we're going to close out the show. I'm just going to mention a couple names that are interesting to me as potential hires to fill out this coaching staff. So we'll get to all of that here in just a minute. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL season's here, and FanDuel has an offer you don't want to miss. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you're going to get $300 in bonus bets. That's right. You pick a bet, you put down $5, and if it hits, you're going to unlock $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. I love using FanDuel because it fits however you like to place a bet, whether it's player props, building a same game parlay, even jumping in live as the action unfolds. It makes watching football even more exciting when you got a little bit of something riding on the action, whether you're a casual fan or love diving into the stats. FanDuel makes the game day experience so much better. It's quick, it's easy, and the best way to add a little more energy to your Sundays. So if you're ready to play, download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you're going to get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Help us get closer to our next goal of 15,000 subscribers. I'd love to get there by the end of the month. We're getting closer and closer. I really do appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. All right, so let's talk about a couple of coaches that just stand out to me as potential options to fill some of these vacancies. The first name is a familiar one, Carlos Beltrán. Beltrán right now is a special assistant or advisor to the president of baseball operations in David Stearns. So he is working for the team. And we know that he was supposed to be the manager heading into the 2020 season. But it was right after that Houston Astros sign stealing scandal broke, that big story. And it's funny because Carlos Beltrán has seemingly dealt with more of a fallout of that than anybody else. You have AJ Hinch and Alex Cora both managing teams in the playoffs this year. And Carlos Beltrán, still on the sidelines, has not gotten that opportunity to manage elsewhere. When he was going to be a big league manager not that long after his playing career. But he had earned that with the incredible playing career that he had, a Hall of Fame career. And I remember that introductory press conference. I have never been more fired up for a Mets manager than seeing Carlos Beltrán take that podium and address the media. I was so excited. So to me, if Beltrán is ready to get back in the dugout and be in the grind full time, I don't think you could find a better bench coach. And the other thing about that too, while he does not have the experience of a John Gibbons, and I get that that might be something that you want, right? You wanted an experienced bench coach with your rookie manager, but now Carlos Mendoza is entering year 3. I think having Beltrán in that clubhouse day in and day out, I think that would help this team tremendously. He is such an incredible baseball mind, but also not that you're thinking this way, because I'm sure that David Stearns and Carlos Mendoza are not going through this process of hiring a bench coach thinking about who's next in line. But that is something that is pretty fair, that the bench coach typically becomes the interim manager if something happens. I'm not saying that Carlos Mendoza is going to be let go. I'm really not. But having Beltrán in waiting, to me, it's an exciting prospect. I would just love to see him part of the staff, part of the day-to-day. I think more Carlos Beltrán is good for the New York Mets. And if he could take that role as the bench coach, I'd be all in on that. Another name that just jumps out, a big name coach. Ron Washington is out there. Now, he's 73 years old. He was the manager of the Angels the last couple of years, but left in the middle of this past season because he needed quadruple bypass heart surgery. So health is the number one question about if Ron Washington is even going to get back into coaching. But he told The Athletic that he was let go due to performance, not to his health, essentially suggesting that he is healthy and could coach again. Now, will Wash try to interview for some vacant managerial positions? Potentially. But if he can't get those and you can land him, I mean, you could not find a better third base coach and infield coach than Ron Washington. He held that role for the Braves from 2017 through 2023. You want to improve your defense? Bring Ron Washington onto your staff. So if that's even at all a possibility, I'm interviewing Ron Washington. And you want your experience, that's a baseball lifer. If the Mets got Ron Washington coach third and Carlos Beltrán to be their bench coach, I'm all in. Now, when it comes to the nuances of a hitting coach or a pitching coach, I can't tell you who's good. I really can't. We can read about these guys after they're hired or when they're interviewed and, oh, this guy worked at Driveline for 6 or 7 years, or this guy was the hitting coach or the pitching coach for this organization or this farm system, whatever it is. Unless I'm in the room, and I never would be in the room for those interviews, I can't give you real insights on who the Mets should hire to be their hitting coach or their pitching coach. Again, with Beltrán, it's just a matter of loving him when he was going to be the manager, loving everything I heard, and just thinking the guy's the ultimate competitor. So I think having him on your staff is just a good thing. And Ron Washington, I mean, that's a coach that has a reputation and a resume that carries a lot of weight, right? So those guys to me are pretty kind of cut and dry of guys you'd want to be part of your coaching staff. Now, when it comes to other names, just people that I think you should keep your eye on. If the Mets stay internal with their pitching coach hire, you have Eric Yeagers, who is their vice president of pitching. He's a young guy. I think he's only 30 years old. So he's my age. And there's every chance the Mets want him to take on a bigger role, a more active role in the day-to-day. Eric Yeagers has a lot of fans in the organization. Like, he's one of those names that comes up, and he clearly is a very big part of what the Mets do. So making him the pitching coach, I don't think that's outside the realm of possibility. Also, if you look in the minor leagues, you have AJ Sager, who has spent the past, I believe, 5 seasons in the Mets organization, a year in Brooklyn, I think maybe 3 seasons in Double-A, and then he just was up in Syracuse this past year. But I believe Jonah Tong gave Sager a lot of credit when he was either up or just prior to going up. When he was, I think Sager was the one who told him about the promotion to the big leagues, and he talked about how he's been such a big part of his career, developing him. And so it was really special for him to get that news from Sager. Maybe he's the guy. He's another potential internal candidate. He worked with a lot of these rookie pitchers that are going to be a big part of your rotation next season. So just another name to mention. Now, another internal candidate to take on a different role. Andy Green is the head of player development, but he does have managerial experience, managed with the Padres. He was the bench coach for the Cubs under David Ross and was in line, or he was in the running to be the Mets manager when they hired Carlos Mendoza. Instead of getting the managerial job, he was offered this position of head of player development. And he has taken that, and clearly he's done a good job. The Mets player development has been outstanding the last couple of seasons. And you see a farm system that's in much better standing now than it was when Andy Green got into the organization. Maybe he loves his current job. But if he wants to get back into the dugout, if he wants to be part of the grind again, of being involved with every single game of the 162 and really be part of it all in that capacity instead of being more part of the future, I think he's a candidate to be a bench coach for sure. David Ross, since I mentioned his name, I did look it up. He is still out there, but he's holding out hope that he can get a managerial job. But if he doesn't, I mean, David Ross, one of the ultimate just clubhouse guys over the past couple decades. I mean, as he was Austin Hedges before Austin Hedges, the guy that was on a lot of teams because he was such a good catcher and such a good leader. And I don't think he did a bad job with the Cubs whatsoever. I thought he was actually a really good manager with them. So if he was out there and he wanted to get back in the dugout and he didn't get a managerial job, and you could hire him as your bench coach, I think that'd be a home run as well. When it comes to these hires, there's a couple different ways that the Mets could go about it. They could be looking at experience, guys that have been in big league dugouts for a long time, or they can look for analytics and look for the cutting edge baseball minds, the guys that have been working at Driveline and all these different pitching factories who know the analytics so well that you want them teaching your players, whether it's hitting or pitching. I think the ideal sort of route is to get a little bit of both. You maybe hire that cutting edge pitching coach, but you bring in a guy like Ron Washington to coach third and give you a ton of experience on your bench. You get Carlos Mendoza, you get Carlos Beltrán to be your bench coach, who doesn't have a ton of coaching experience, but a lot of baseball experience. But then again, you maybe have a more experienced hitting coach. You get a hitting coach that you bring in that has been around for a long time. It's maybe been a hitting coach in the big leagues for 10 seasons, potentially, if that guy is out there. And I really don't know who is out there in that regard. But we're going to find out what the Mets choose to do, obviously, because they're going to be announcing these hires, I would assume, over the coming weeks, potentially. If you can get this all wrapped up before you get to the winter meetings, I think that's ideal. Even, potentially well before the winter meetings, if possible, to just have that coaching staff in place. I think this is the primary focus right now for this team. You can't do anything with your roster. So, like I said before, might as well go through a process of hiring some new coaches, and we'll see what the staff ultimately ends up looking like. And once we get to that point, obviously, I'll break down any and all hires the Mets make and what we're hearing about them. But that's the latest here on the New York Mets. A complete change on Friday. Clean house of the coaching staff to start anew. And we'll see if that ends up being the difference for the Mets next season. Obviously, we won't know. And roster construction and player performance are going to dictate a lot more than the coaches probably can. But I think you'll be able to tell if there is a better, how do they say, clubhouse culture. I think I've thrown that around too much already on the show today because I don't think the culture was way off. But if this team's winning a lot of baseball games, ultimately you could probably say this was the right move. So we'll see how it all shakes out. But that's going to be all for this edition of Locked On Mets. I'll be back with the show on Monday unless we get some more news. And I'll be breaking down probably the Pete Alonso situation. I definitely want to talk about Pete and Edwin Diaz this week. So expect shows on that coming up here. And we will, of course, continue to react to what happened this past season, breaking down individual performances for guys that will be back next season, and also looking towards the future with some of the top prospects that we'll be discussing like I did on yesterday's show. If you want to check that out, if you missed it, where I talked about how Jet Williams and Carson Bench could play into the Mets starting lineup next season, potentially. Again, though, that's going to be all. As always, make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. Help us get to that next goal of 15,000 subscribers. If you want to be Locked On Mets Insider and be part of our texting service, you can find a link in the episode description, or you can go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets.